After years of stepping back from the noise of cameras, interviews, and flashing lights, he'd found a kind of peace in the quiet. Not the dramatic movie-style peace with sweeping sunsets and perfect silence, but the real kind. The kind that comes with worn-out slippers, a slightly leaky faucet in the kitchen, and the soft hum of an old refrigerator that's seen better days. His apartment wasn't fancy. No marble floors or floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Just simple furniture, a few well-loved books on a shelf, and a window box with herbs he tried and sometimes failed to keep alive. People often assumed someone like him, someone the world thought they knew, would live in a mansion behind tall gates. But fame had taught him early on that the more people see you, the less they really know. So he chose small, chose ordinary, chose to disappear into the rhythm of everyday life, buying groceries, fixing a flat tire, waiting in line at the coffee shop like anyone else. Most folks didn't recognize him right away, especially with a baseball cap pulled low and a tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And when they did, he'd nod politely, answer a question or two if asked kindly, then slip away before it turned into a scene. He hadn't spoken about love in public for a very long time. Not because he didn't believe in it, he did more than ever, but because the subject carried too much weight. Too many memories tucked into its corners, too much pain wrapped in what should have been joy. Every time someone asked, "What do you think about love?" In an interview, he'd give a careful, vague answer, something safe, something that wouldn't open the door he'd worked so hard to close. But silence, he was starting to learn, isn't always protection. Sometimes it's just another kind of hiding. One late afternoon, the sky turned gray without warning. Rain began falling in heavy sheets, turning the streets into mirrors and sidewalks into shallow rivers. He was driving home from a quiet errand, just picking up a few things from the hardware store, when he saw a car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking like a heartbeat. A figure stood beside it, soaked and shivering, trying to wrestle with a flat tire. He slowed down, hesitated. Part of him wanted to keep driving. Not out of coldness, but out of habit. Years of being approached, photographed, asked for things, sometimes gently, sometimes desperately, had made him cautious. But then he saw how young the person looked, how alone, and something in his chest tugged, familiar and insistent. He pulled over. "Need a hand?" he called out, already stepping into the rain with an umbrella in one hand and a tire iron in the other. The person, a young woman with rainwater streaming down her face, looked up, startled. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she didn't say his name, just nodded, voice catching. "Yeah, thanks, I don't really know what I'm doing." He didn't make a big deal of it, didn't offer a famous smile or a quote for a future story. He just got to work. Knee on the wet pavement, hands steady despite the cold. He loosened the lug nuts and swapped the tire with quiet efficiency. She held the umbrella over him, awkwardly at first, then more steadily. When it was done, he stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave a small nod. "Should get you home." She didn't thank him right away. Instead, she stared at the wet road, voice barely above the sound of the rain. I broke up with someone last week. Someone I thought I'd spend my life with. And now I keep wondering, was any of it real? Or was I just imagining love?" He paused. The question hung between them, raw and honest. Most people would have offered a quick pep talk. "You'll find someone better," or "plenty of fish in the sea." But he knew those words were band-aids on open wounds. They sound kind, but they don't heal. So he didn't say any of that. Instead, he looked at her, not as a fan, not as a stranger, but as one human to another, and said softly, "Love isn't about how long it lasts. It's about how real it felt while it was there." She blinked, surprised. "But if it ends, doesn't that mean it wasn't enough?" He shook his head. "No. Sometimes the deepest love happens in the shortest time. And that doesn't make it less. It just makes it precious." She didn't reply right away. Just stood there, holding the umbrella, rain dripping off the edges. Then quietly, "I wish more people talked about love like that. Not like a prize you win or lose, but like something that changes you no matter how it ends." He felt something shift inside him then. A crack in the wall he'd built. Because she was right. The world was full of stories about love as a destination, happily ever after, perfect matches, soulmates who never argue. But nobody talked about the quiet courage it takes to love fully, knowing it might not last. Nobody talked about how love leaves marks even when it's gone. Good marks. Healing marks. He got back in his car, gave a final wave, and drove off. But her words stayed with him. That night, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, he thought about all the times he'd stayed silent. Not out of pride, but out of protection. For himself, for the memories, for the people he'd loved and lost. He'd thought silence was respect. But maybe, just maybe, silence was also a kind of erasure. As if those moments of love never mattered because they ended in pain. And that wasn't true. Not even close. He remembered holding someone's hand in a hospital room, saying nothing, just being there. He remembered laughing until his stomach hurt over something silly. He remembered the way sunlight used to fall across a certain pillow in the morning. These weren't failures because they ended. They were proof that he'd lived deeply, loved deeply. The next morning he woke up with a strange feeling. Not sadness, but purpose. Not loud or dramatic, just a quiet knowing. Someone needed to hear the truth about love. Not the polished version. Not the fairy tale. But the real, messy, beautiful, heartbreaking truth, and maybe, just maybe, it was time he stopped hiding from it. He didn't plan to write a book or go on a talk show. He wasn't looking for attention. But if the chance came to speak honestly, to say that love isn't about guarantees, but about showing up with your whole heart, even when you're scared, that felt like something worth doing because staying silent hadn't helped anyone. Not him, not the woman on the roadside. Not the millions of people scrolling through their phones, feeling alone in their heartbreak, wondering if they're the only ones who loved and lost and still believe in kindness. Love isn't perfect. It doesn't always last, but it's never wasted, and that's something worth saying out loud. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still held that soft, damp quiet that follows a storm. He sat at the kitchen table again, the same chipped mug in his hands, steam long gone. Sleep hadn't come easy. Not because of the weather, but because of the conversation, the one that had slipped through his defenses like a key turning in a rusted lock. He kept hearing her voice. I just wish someone would tell me the truth about love. It wasn't the first time someone had said something like that to him. Over the years, strangers had approached him in airports, cafes, even on quiet park benches, always with that same look in their eyes. Not starstruck, not asking for autographs, just searching, hoping he might have answers because of the roles he'd played, the life people imagined he'd lived. But this time felt different. Maybe because she hadn't asked for advice. She'd just spoken her truth, raw and unguarded, and in doing so, had accidentally handed him back a piece of his own. He hadn't planned to think about the past today. He rarely did. Not on purpose, anyway. But memories have a way of rising when you least expect them, like bubbles in still water. And once one surfaces, the rest follow. He remembered a small apartment years ago, sunlight streaming through thin curtains, the smell of coffee and old books, the sound of laughter that felt like home. He remembered how love didn't announce itself with fireworks or grand declarations. It showed up in the little things, a hand brushing against his as they washed dishes, a shared glance during a bad movie, the way someone would hum softly while folding laundry. It wasn't perfect. They argued sometimes, misunderstood each other, but there was always a return, a quiet, I'm still here in the way they'd reach for each other after a hard day. And then there was the joy, bright, unexpected, overwhelming. The kind that comes when you least expect it, like the first time they found out they were going to be parents. He could still feel the weight of that moment, the disbelief, the fear, the wild, soaring hope. They'd sat on the edge of the bed holding hands, not saying much, just letting the wonder sink in. They talked about names, about cribs, about how they'd raised their child to be kind. They imagined bedtime stories, scraped knees, first days of school. They built a whole future in their minds, brick by quiet brick. But life doesn't always follow the blueprint. He remembered the hospital room, too bright, too sterile. The silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy. The way time seemed to stop and stretch at the same time. He remembered holding his daughter so small, so perfect, knowing she wouldn't stay long. And in that moment, love didn't feel like joy. It felt like courage, like showing up with your whole heart, even when your heart is breaking. People often think love is only the happy parts, the weddings, the anniversaries, the I love yous, whispered in the dark. But real love? It's also the hard parts, the sitting in silence when there are no words, the holding on when everything says to let go, the choosing to care even when it hurts. After she was gone, the world kept moving. Cars drove by. People laughed on the street. The sun rose and set like nothing had changed. But everything had. He walked through days like a ghost, going through motions but feeling untethered. Friends reached out, but he didn't know how to tell them that the person they knew, the one who joked easily, who believed in happy endings, wasn't quite there anymore. He didn't blame love for the pain. That would have been like blaming the ocean for being deep. Love wasn't the problem. Loss was just the shadow side of caring deeply. And he'd rather have loved and lost than never loved at all. Not because it's a pretty saying, but because it's true. Without that love, those moments, even the short ones, would have never existed. And that would have been the real tragedy. In the years that followed, he kept his heart guarded. Not closed exactly. Just careful. He dated quietly, rarely spoke of it, and never let anyone get too close too fast. Not out of fear, but out of respect. For himself, for the people he'd lost, and for the next person who might walk into his life. He knew now that love isn't something you control. You can't plan it, schedule it, or guarantee it. You can only be ready to meet it when it comes and to honor it however long it stays. That's what he wished more people understood. Love isn't a trophy. It's not something you win by being perfect or saying the right things. It's not a contract that promises forever. It's a choice you make every day to listen, to show up, to be kind even when you're tired, to forgive when you're hurt. And sometimes it's choosing to let go with grace when it's time. He thought about the woman on the roadside again. She was grieving a breakup, yes, but beneath that, she was grieving the story she'd told herself. The story that said if love ends, it must not have been real. That if someone leaves, you weren't enough. He knew that story well. He'd believed it once too. But the truth is messier and more beautiful. Sometimes people love each other as best they can, and it still isn't enough to make it work. That doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It just means two good people couldn't find a way forward together, and that's okay. It doesn't erase the good moments. It doesn't make the laughter fake or the care pretend. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city waking up. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. A neighbor walked their dog. Life. Ordinary and ongoing. He realized something then. Staying silent hadn't protected the memory of the people he loved. If anything, it had hidden the lessons they'd taught him. The way his partner used to say, "It's okay to not be okay," when he was stressed. The way his daughter's tiny fingers had curled around his thumb, even in her last hours. Those weren't just private moments. They were truths about what it means to be human, to love, to lose, to keep going. And maybe those truths could help someone else feel less alone. He didn't need to shout it from a stage. Didn't need headlines. But if the chance came to speak honestly, to say that love isn't about perfection but presence, that felt like a gift he could give. Not as a celebrity, but as someone who'd lived it. Because the world doesn't need more fairy tales. It needs more honesty. More people saying, "Yeah, it hurt, but it was still worth it." He made a fresh cup of tea. This time he let it steep long enough to be warm when he took the first sip. Outside, the clouds were breaking. A patch of blue appeared in the sky, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel the need to look away from the past. He just let it sit with him, gently like an old friend, because love in all its forms deserves to be remembered. Not as a wound, but as a witness. A reminder that even in the hardest times we are capable of incredible tenderness, and that's something worth passing on. A week passed, and the city settled into one of those calm stretches where nothing much happens. No headlines, no drama, just people living their ordinary lives. He'd almost convinced himself the roadside encounter was a dream, something his mind had stitched together from old memories and rainy day thoughts. But then, late one evening, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was short, polite, and carried none of the usual excitement or demands he'd come to expect. Just, "Hi, it's the person you helped with the flat tire. I know you probably don't remember me, but I wanted to say thank you again. And I was wondering if you'd be open to talking a little more? Not for anything public, just human to human." He read it 3 times. Most people would have assumed it was a setup, a journalist fishing for a story, a fan trying to get close. But something in the tone felt different, quiet, respectful, like she understood the weight of asking for more time from someone who rarely gave it. He almost didn't reply. Old habits die hard, but then he thought about what she'd said that night, how she wished someone would tell the truth about love. And he realized maybe this wasn't just about her. Maybe it was about him too. About finally letting the truth out of its cage, so he typed back, "Sure, coffee?" They met at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a bike repair shop. Nowhere fancy, nowhere anyone would expect to find him. She arrived first, sitting by the window with a notebook open but untouched. When he walked in, she didn't jump up or wave. Just smiled softly like she was glad he came, but wouldn't make a scene if he changed his mind. He ordered black coffee, sat down, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Not out of awkwardness, but because sometimes silence is the most honest place to start. Finally, she said, "I've been writing. Not for a big site or anything. Just a little blog where I try to make sense of things. Heartbreak, healing, how to keep going when it feels like the ground's gone out from under you." She paused, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "After we talked, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. That love isn't about how long it lasts, but how real it felt. It hit me like someone finally named something I'd been feeling but couldn't explain." He nodded slowly. "It's easy to confuse love with permanence. Like if it ends, it must have been fake. But that's not how it works." "I know," she said. "But when you're in the middle of it, when you're crying into your pillow at 2 a.m. wondering what you did wrong, it's hard to remember that." He looked out the window for a moment. A couple walked by holding hands, laughing about something small. "I used to think love was supposed to fix everything," he admitted. "That if you found the right person, the pain would stop. But it doesn't work like that. Love doesn't erase your problems. It just gives you someone to face them with." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you think people expect too much from love these days?" "Maybe," he said. "We see these perfect couples online. Always smiling, always on vacation, always saying the right thing. But real love isn't like that. Real love is messy. It's tired. It's choosing to stay kind even when you're exhausted. It's forgiving someone for leaving dishes in the sink. And them forgiving you for snapping after a bad day." She smiled faintly. "So it's less about grand gestures and more about showing up?" "Exactly," he said. "It's in the small things. Making coffee for someone before they wake up. Listening, even when you don't have the answer. Sitting with them in silence when words aren't enough." She was quiet for a while, then asked gently, "Have you ever been afraid to love again after everything?" He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't nosy. It came from a place of shared understanding. "Yeah," he finally said. "Not because I didn't believe in love anymore, but because I knew how much it could hurt, and I didn't know if I had it in me to go through that again." "But you still believe in it?" "I do," he said, voice steady. "Because the pain doesn't cancel out the beauty. Losing someone doesn't mean the love wasn't worth it. It just means you loved deeply, and that's never a waste." She nodded, eyes a little shiny, but she didn't look away. Would you mind if I wrote about some of this? Not using your name. Not even hinting who you are. Just the ideas, the truth about love you shared. I think it could help people." He considered it. Really considered it. Not out of caution, but out of care. He didn't want his words twisted or turned into clickbait, but he also didn't want to hide the truth just because he was afraid of how it might be used. "Only if you promise one thing," he said. "What's that?" "That you keep it real. No sugarcoating. No everything happens for a reason stuff, just honest. I promise," she said. They talked a while longer. Not about fame, not about the past in detail. Just about what it means to be human, to hope, to hurt, to keep your heart open even when it's been bruised. When they parted, there was no fanfare, just a quiet thank you and a handshake that lingered a second longer than usual. Two people recognizing something familiar in each other. A few days later, a short piece appeared on her blog. No flashy title. Just what real love actually looks like. It didn't go viral right away, but slowly people started sharing it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt true. Comments poured in. "This made me cry in a good way. I needed to hear this today." Finally, someone said it without pretending love is perfect. He read it once, then closed the tab. He didn't check the comments. Didn't need to. He just felt lighter, like he'd passed a torch, not for glory, but for connection. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was hiding. He was just sharing, and that, he realized, was its own kind of love. The piece spread slower than wildfire, but deeper, like water soaking into dry ground. It didn't explode with millions of views overnight. Instead, it found its way quietly into corners of the internet where people were actually looking for something real. Late night scrolling after a breakup, lunch break spent staring at a screen feeling lonely, quiet mornings when the weight of the world felt too heavy to carry alone. At first, he didn't pay much attention. He'd kept his word. He'd shared what felt true and he'd let it go. But then a friend sent him a screenshot of a comment thread. Not the usual noise, but something different. One person wrote, "This reminded me that my last relationship wasn't a failure just because it ended. We loved each other as best we could. That still matters." Another said, "I've been blaming myself for months. Reading this felt like someone finally gave me permission to stop." He read those words and felt a strange mix of relief and humility. He hadn't set out to fix anyone. He hadn't even used his name. But somehow his quiet truth had landed exactly where it was needed. Still, he stayed out of it. Didn't comment. Didn't hint that he was involved. He knew how quickly sincerity can get twisted when fame enters the room. He wanted the message to stand on its own, not because a well-known face said it, but because it resonated on its own merit. But the world had other plans. A few weeks later, the blog post caught the eye of a small podcast host who focused on emotional wellness and everyday resilience. They reached out to the writer, not for gossip, not for drama, but to ask if they'd be willing to talk more about the ideas in the piece. The writer agreed, and during the interview they were careful not to reveal who'd inspired the words. They just said, "Someone I met recently, someone who's known deep loss and still chooses kindness, shared something that changed how I see love." That was enough. Listeners started speculating. Not in a creepy or invasive way, but with genuine curiosity. "Who talks like that?" someone asked online. "It sounds like something he would say." And slowly, quietly, people began to connect the dots. Not because anyone confirmed it, but because the tone, the humility, the lack of self-pity, the focus on others, felt familiar to those who'd followed his journey over the years. But instead of turning it into a spectacle, something unexpected happened. People didn't chase the mystery. They leaned into the message. Memes didn't pop up. Tabloids didn't run wild. Instead, teachers shared the post with students learning about healthy relationships. Therapists referenced it in sessions. Friends sent it to each other with a simple, "This made me think of you." He noticed it in small ways, too. At the grocery store, a cashier paused while bagging his groceries and said softly, "Thank you for reminding us that love isn't about perfection." He didn't correct her. Didn't say it wasn't him. He just nodded and said, "Thank you for listening." On a park bench one afternoon, an older man sat beside him, not too close, just near enough, and said, "My wife passed 5 years ago. I still talk to her sometimes." Reading that piece, it made me feel like that's okay. Like love doesn't end just because someone's gone. He looked at the man, saw the quiet grief in his eyes, and said, "It's more than okay. It's beautiful." That night he sat on his balcony watching the city lights flicker on one by one. He thought about how strange it was, that words spoken in a moment of honesty with no plan or agenda could ripple out so far. He hadn't given a speech, hadn't written a book, hadn't even used his name, and yet people were finding comfort in something he'd helped plant. It made him think about how we often wait for the big moment to make a difference, the grand gesture, the viral video, the headline. But real change usually starts small, a conversation on a rainy roadside, a cup of coffee shared in silence, a few honest sentences typed late at night. He also realized something else. Staying silent hadn't protected the truth. It had just kept it locked away. And truth, like love, isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be passed on. Gently, carefully, but without fear. A few days later, the writer reached out again. Not for more quotes or attention, but to say thank you. "People are writing to me every day," she said over the phone. "Not about you, about themselves. They're sharing their own stories of love and loss. It's like your words gave them permission to be honest." He smiled. "That's all I ever hoped for." She paused. "Would you consider writing something yourself? Just a short letter, anonymous if you want, but from your heart, I think people need to hear it directly." He thought about it, really thought. Not out of ego, but out of responsibility. If his voice, his real, unfiltered perspective could help even one more person feel less alone, wasn't that worth stepping into the light for just a moment? So he sat down one quiet evening with just a notebook and a pen and wrote. Not for fame, not for praise, but for the woman on the roadside, for the man on the park bench, for everyone who's ever loved deeply and wondered if it was enough. He wrote about how love isn't a guarantee, it's a gift, how presence matters more than promises, how grief and gratitude can live in the same heart, how showing up, even when you're scared, is the bravest kind of love. When he was done, he sent it to her with one note. Share it only if it feels right, and never say it's from me. She published it the next week under the title, A Letter to Anyone Who's Ever Loved and Lost. This time it spread faster, not because of who wrote it, but because of how it made people feel, seen, understood, less broken, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was hiding from his past. He felt like he was honoring it, not with grand speeches or public confessions, but with quiet truth, offered freely, like a hand held out in the rain. And that, he realized, was enough. He never claimed the letter, never hinted it was his, and in time people stopped trying to figure out who wrote it. They didn't need to. The words had taken on a life of their own, passed between friends, printed on sticky notes stuck to mirrors, read aloud at small gatherings where people were learning to heal together. That was enough, more than enough. What surprised him most wasn't the reach of the message, but how it changed him. For years he'd carried his past like something fragile, something that needed to be protected from the world, kept in a quiet room where no one could touch it. But sharing even a sliver of that truth without names or drama had done something unexpected. It had lightened the weight. Not because the memories were gone, they never would be, but because they were no longer his alone to hold. He started noticing things he used to overlook. The way a stranger would hold the door open a second longer, just in case someone was coming. How a barista would remember a regular's order and smile like it mattered. The quiet patience of a parent kneeling to tie their child's shoe on a busy sidewalk. These weren't grand acts of love. They were tiny, everyday choices to be kind. And they were everywhere once you started looking. He began showing up more, not in headlines, but in life. He volunteered at a community center on weekends, not as a celebrity, but as another pair of hands willing to help. He didn't give speeches, didn't pose for photos. He just washed dishes after shared meals, stacked donated books, or sat with someone who needed company but didn't feel like talking. One Saturday morning, he was helping set up chairs for a local event, a small gathering for people rebuilding their lives after loss. As he unfolded a folding chair, a woman walked by with a tray of coffee cups. She didn't recognize him, or if she did, she didn't say anything. She just handed him a cup and said, "You look like you could use this." He thanked her, and they stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the room fill with people carrying their own invisible weights. "You know," she said after a while, "I read that letter, the one about love and loss. It got me through a really hard week." He nodded. "It helped me too." She looked at him, really looked, and smiled. Funny how that works, isn't it? Sometimes the thing that heals you is the same thing that helps someone else. He thought about that all day. Love wasn't just something you received or gave in big defining moments. It was also something you passed along, like a quiet flame from one candle to another. A kind word, a listening ear, a moment of patience when you're tired. These things didn't make headlines, but they built the world people actually wanted to live in. A few weeks later, he was walking home from the grocery store, canvas bags in hand, when he passed a small community garden tucked between two apartment buildings. He'd seen it before but never stopped. Today, something made him pause. Kids were helping plant seedlings, their hands covered in dirt, laughing as they argued over who got to water the tomatoes. An older man showed a teenager how to space the rows properly. A woman tied twine around young sunflowers to help them stand tall. It was messy, imperfect, and full of life. He stood there for a long moment, watching. Then a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, looked up, saw him, and without hesitation, plucked a bright yellow sunflower from a bucket of freshly cut blooms. She ran over, bare feet slapping against the pavement, and held it out to him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "For being kind," she said simply. He crouched down so he wasn't towering over her. "How do you know I'm kind?" She shrugged. "My grandma says kind people have soft eyes." Ears look soft. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just took the flower, touched a hand gently to her head and said, "Thank you." She grinned and ran back to her row of plants, already forgetting him. He walked home with the sunflower in his hand, its petals warm from the afternoon sun. When he got back to his apartment, he filled a glass with water and placed it on the windowsill, right beside the struggling basil plant he'd been trying to keep alive. That night, he didn't think about the past with sadness. He thought about the girl's smile, the woman with the coffee, the hands in the garden working together without needing to say much. He realized then that love wasn't just something that happened to you. It was something you chose to do every day in small and ordinary ways. He didn't need to write another letter, didn't need to give another interview. The message was already out there, living in the way people treated each other, in the courage to be honest about heartbreak, in the willingness to say, "Me too," when someone shares their pain. And maybe that was the real legacy, not fame, not films, not even the roles people remembered him for, but the quiet ripple of kindness that kept moving long after the moment had passed. He sat by the window, sipping tea, watching the sunflower catch the last light of the day. Outside, the city hummed with its usual noise, cars, voices, distant music. But inside, there was peace. Not the kind that comes from having all the answers, but the kind that comes from knowing you've shown up as best you could. He thought about the woman on the roadside, the one who'd asked for the truth about love. He hoped she was okay, hoped she'd found her own version of peace. And if she ever read this story, if she ever connected the dots, she'd know that her question had mattered. That her honesty had opened a door not just for herself, but for countless others. Because that's how real change happens. Not with explosions, but with whispers. Not with perfection, but with presence. He turned off the lamp and let the room fill with twilight. The sunflower stood tall in its glass, simple and bright against the fading light. And as he headed to bed, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not closure exactly, but completion. Not an ending, but a quiet understanding. Love doesn't always last forever, but when it's real, it leaves something behind, not scars, but seeds. And if you're willing to plant them, even in the smallest corners of the world, they grow. There was no grand finale, no spotlight moment, no final bow. Life didn't work that way, not the real kind anyway. And after everything, he'd learned to love the quiet rhythm of ordinary days more than any applause. But something had shifted. Not in the world around him, but in how he moved through it. He still kept to himself most of the time, still avoided the noise of fame when he could. Yet now, when he passed someone on the street who looked like they were carrying a heavy heart, he didn't just walk by. Sometimes he'd offer a nod that said, "I see you." Sometimes he'd hold a door a second longer. Small things. Human things. One afternoon, while walking through a neighborhood he rarely visited, he noticed a little free library box nailed to a fence post. It was painted bright blue with sunflowers hand-drawn along the sides. Inside were a few well-worn paperbacks, a children's book with dog-eared pages, and tucked between them, a folded piece of notebook paper. Curious, he pulled it out. It wasn't a letter or a poem, just a few lines written in careful handwriting. Love isn't about never getting hurt, it's about choosing to care anyway. Thank you for reminding me that's okay. At the bottom, no name, just a small doodle of a sunflower. He stood there for a long moment, the paper warm in his hands. He didn't know who'd left it. Maybe someone who'd read the anonymous letter. Maybe someone who'd heard a friend quote it. Or maybe just someone who'd figured it out on their own and wanted to pass it on. That was the beautiful thing. He didn't need to know. The message had grown legs. It was walking on its own now, finding its way into corners he'd never see, touching lives he'd never meet. And that was better than any credit. He placed the note back in the box right on top so the next person would find it easily. Then he kept walking. A few days later, he got a plain envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo, slightly blurry, taken from a distance. It showed him crouched down, accepting the sunflower from the little girl in the garden. On the back, in the same neat handwriting as the note, it said, "You didn't see me that day, but I saw you, and it mattered." He didn't know who took it, didn't try to find out. He just pinned the photo to the corkboard in his kitchen, beside a grocery list and a reminder to water the plants. Not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder. You never know who's watching. And sometimes just being kind, without expecting anything back, is the most powerful thing you can do. He started paying more attention to the spaces between the big moments. The way a bus driver says, "Have a good one," like he really means it. How a neighbor leaves extra lemons from their tree in a basket by the sidewalk with a sign that says, "Help yourself." The teenager who picks up litter in the park even though no one asked them to. These weren't stories the world shouted about, but they were the glue holding everything together. One rainy Tuesday, he stopped by a small cafe he'd never been to before. As he waited in line, he overheard two people at a corner table talking in low voices. One was crying softly. The other wasn't trying to fix it, just holding their hand, listening. He remembered how years ago he would have looked away, not wanting to intrude. But now he understood. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is witness someone's humanity without judgment. When it was his turn to order, he paid for his coffee and the coffee of the person behind him. Not to be seen. Not for thanks. Just because he could, the barista smiled. "That was really nice of you." He shrugged. "Someone did the same for me once, felt good. Thought I'd pass it on, and that was it. No fanfare, no follow-up. Just a small act, rippling outward in ways he'd never track." Later that week, he visited the community garden again. Not to volunteer, just to walk through. The sunflowers were taller now, their faces turned toward the light. The little girl wasn't there, but an older woman tending the